What's up, guys? It's Terry
and Rowan.
We're here from ArtSmart TV, bringing you another episode of the HSC Economics Review.
And what are we covering?
Today, we are in our fourth part of our four-part series, just looking at a bunch of analysis around the 2023-2024 budget. And we're focusing this time on income distribution and living standards. Now, there's some very interesting interplay that I see here with inflation, and the cost of living crisis that's caused, and what the government's going to do to prevent any kind of long-term living standards and income distribution issues. So I think it's quite interesting.
I think it's quite complex as well, right? Because exactly right. Like we've got living standards, but it has a strong interplay, right, with particularly inflation. So I think maybe let's just start with a little quick sort of starting point, right? Which is, we've got a cost of living crisis, right? Now, this is, I guess, the exact interaction between inflation and living standards, right? And distribution of income, in fact, because inflation is going to have interesting impacts on the distribution of income. So I think we've seen, the price of food has increased by over 11.3% in the last year. So I know we've said inflation, in past videos, hit a peak of 7.8%, but that's that's the CPI, right? That's overall. There's certain areas that have had much bigger growth. On top of that, we saw living costs increase by 9.6%, the largest since the series started in 1999. Okay, the Salvation Army has said that 46% of Australians have reported feeling increased pressure as the cost of living continues to rise. So we're seeing this situation where we've got lots of things increasing in cost, right? And that's going to have an impact on people's living standards.
Yeah, and I'm actually surprised by that 46%. I thought that'd be 96%. I'm sure even, if you think about yourselves and your families, I'm sure you've heard, mum or dad complain, oh, this has gone up in price, that's gone up in price. Yeah, I think most people, like everyone in Australia, has definitely felt some impact of this current cost of living crisis. Now, so Ron, you were saying about how that's going to affect, income distribution. And I think what's a little unfortunate with the way that income distribution is measured is, first of all, that's done through the Gini coefficient of both income and wealth. Yeah. Now, wealth probably tends to be done a little later than income, but even with income, the most recent data we've got is for 2020. Now, you think about 2020, that's 3 years ago now.
And the world looks a lot different.
It's a very different world. We're living in COVID. And so obviously that gave them a big push to get that data out during COVID to see the effects of COVID on different households. And so the data that we do have hasn't even included the current cost of living crisis.
And it sort of makes it a little bit hard from an analysis point of view. Because at the end of the day, right, what we're trying to do when we look at the impact of government policy on an issue is you're trying to look at, first of all, what's the objective? What are they trying to achieve here? And then how do they measure up? Or, what are some of the questions on whether or not they will measure up? And so the hard thing that we have here is that, well, certainly we know what inflation looks like and we can see the increased cost of living, which goes to living standards, right? In terms of, but it's certainly very hard to understand, the impact on income distribution. And it does make it a little bit harder for you to analyze. Now, in saying that, I think one of the things you can do, and we'll certainly look at it, is that you can still, though, I think in your analysis, highlight, at a theoretical level where it's likely to have, implications. Yeah. And you can also draw, if you're really advanced, right, some comparisons with prior periods, right? So you might look at, for example, GFC, right, and go, well, okay, during this period, we saw, income inequality worsen, we saw wealth inequality worsen, right? So you can draw the likelihood to say, well, there's a similar set of circumstances here, right? Yeah. But there's some limitations just in how much you can say fundamentally.
Yeah, and I wouldn't shy away from that. If you're looking at getting this as two of your essay choice options in your trials or in the HSC, I think there's definitely, if anything, if you're confident and there's a lot of space for you to really show off what you know and how you understand the economy works and how policy works. So I think it's definitely not something you should shy away from. So keep watching.
I just want to add to that. I think my observation is that often the distribution of income essays are not, they've got a lot of opportunity, but my observation is when I've been marking them, that often then, they're pretty superficial, surface level, they're not done all that, which is, I think, your point, right? There's a really big opportunity if you take a bit of time to really dig in, to really shine. So
let's dig in.
Right? First of all, really quickly, let's just look at some of the data points, right? Because there's not a clear objective, this is the target Gini coefficient, right, that the government is aiming for.
Mm.
but we can certainly track what it has been. So what has it been?
Yeah, so currently, with our most recent data, 2020, it was 0.324. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but I know in your course you should know that closer to zero, the better, right? But I think what kind of puts that in context is then when you look at how we compare to other similar nations, and the measuring stick that we use is the OECD. And so of the 33 OECD nations, we are actually ranked 11th highest. So
that's not a good thing.
Yeah, probably,
right? Higher.
Yeah, you want to be low. So so this is saying the numerical value is 11th highest, which is 11th worst, right? We have the 11th highest level of inequality, and wealth isn't much better. So if you have a look at wealth, at the moment we're at 0.62, and that's actually back at based on what it was in the GFC.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I think what's interesting, just to highlight here, zooming out for a moment, is that at 0.324, right, like that's actually an improvement. During the GFC, it was 0.336, right? In fact, it was up at 0.33 in 2014. So the interesting thing is it has been improving, right, relative to, some of the numbers we've had in the prior decade. But yes, if we look at it globally, not looking so great, right? And certainly our wealth being at 0.62, remember, closer to 1, not so good, right? So that's significantly more. So we do have some stuff there to sort of consider, and I think the real concern, just for a moment to unpack the theory before we look at the policies, right, is that one of the challenges that you have, right, in a period where, and I think Terry highlighted in one of our earlier videos when we were looking at price stability and the labour market, when you have a period of high inflationary pressure, generally speaking, lower income earners have less of a likelihood or less bargaining power because they usually, maybe have, lower skills, right? So that they tend to not see as quicker increases in their income, right, as someone that is higher skilled, more bargaining, more likely to see a closer correlation between wage growth and inflationary pressure, right? So what that means is straight away you've got real incomes going backwards, and they go backwards for everyone when you've got high inflation, but they tend to go backwards quicker for low income earners than they do for high income earners. So in other words, you have a situation where just being in a high, inflationary environment creates an outcome where that alone can already start to worsen income inequality in an economy.
So I guess, where do you then fit policy into this is where you look at, well, if this is going to happen, the real income is going to get eroded, the level of income inequality is very likely going to increase, because remember, we don't have the data on it. So we're speaking here in terms of what the theory would suggest and what the precedent would suggest, that income and wealth inequality tends to go up during a cost of living crisis, is that we're going to be facing worse inequality. And then how do we then frame the policy and how do we judge it is that can it mitigate and reduce the effects of this current crisis?
And again, we've got to remember that, the government hasn't created the inflationary problem, right? Like, they're trying to really respond to the fact that it's going to have this likely impact on distribution of income. And of course, it's going to, through that, erode living standards as well. So let's take a look now at, therefore, some of the policies the government has implemented, and then we can look at some analysis on, are they enough? What is the likely effect, right? So the first one that I'll start with, and then we've got a number of others, is that they have made some increases to welfare, right? And that's the obvious starting point here. The obvious starting point is people that are already on low income are probably getting some form of government support. And so, well, if we can increase their welfare support, right, it's going to increase their income relative to the rest of the population. And so what you can see here is that, for people on Job Seeker, AusStudy, Youth Allowance, they're going to get an additional, wait for it, $40 a fortnight.
Which already doesn't sound good, but if you then do the math, that's less than $3 a day.
And so then you think about where inflation's at.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I'm pretty certain per day the cost of just generally living has gone up more than $3.
Yeah.
So you can sort of see that, okay, great, where maybe, there's some increase here, and we're already doing a little bit of analysis, right? Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of an increase here. Okay, nice. But it by no means is dealing with the level of inflation. Mm-hmm. Therefore, maybe it takes a tiny edge off. Like
an ever tiny slide.
The worsening distribution, but probably not that significant. Now, maybe where they're doing a little bit more is, that they've expanded some of the eligibility over, Job Seeker for those over 55 who often, maybe struggle to find work if they've been in unemployment. And they've also added some increase in payments for single parents by basically increasing the age of their youngest child. right? So they're basically, again, it's eligibility increases, right?
Yeah.
To going, hey, we're not going to maybe spend more in terms of the total amount, but we'll make,
Make it more accessible.
That's right.
And just to clarify, that wasn't Rowan saying they're magically going to turn every 8-year-old into a 14.
No. Although some parents probably would hope for that, right? Or maybe the other way.
14, I don't know.
That's an interesting age, yeah, fair call. So what else are they trying to do here, Terry?
Yeah, so aside from just the very meagre, let's be honest, welfare payments, they've had a very big focus on housing affordability. One of the big concerns at the moment has been rental prices. I mean, there's been, as we mentioned in the inflation video, there's been a lot of issues with new dwelling prices as well, but the government has probably prioritized a little bit here about the renters' experience and what they're going through. So they've expanded something called the Commonwealth Rent Assistance Program. Now, basically, that just pays for the rent, largely subsidizes the rent that renters have to pay, and this is not for government housing. So they're renting on the market, and it will take off about 70% of that rent they're paying. I think it's going up to 85%, so a 15% increase in this budget. It will cost the government $2.7 billion. And if you think about, it's good to put those numbers in, because we remember with the inflation, we talked about how the energy prices, that was $3 billion. And so they are spending a fairly substantial amount of money on this to just help ease some of those pressures that have gone into the rental market.
So now they're doing some other things relating to housing affordability, because I mean that again was something we spoke about. And if you haven't seen the video, go and check out our video where we look at the impact of the budget on price stability and inflation. One of the things that Terry mentioned there, though, is that fundamentally one of the big drivers of both cost of living, really has been housing affordability, right? And that's both from a rental point of view, right, through to particularly the cost of new builds, right? The cost of new builds impacting, therefore, the amount of stock in the market available for rent. So some of the other things they're trying to do here, right, to improve, and it's not really about short-term distribution of income, which is, I think, the other thing that's important to highlight. The 15% is a more immediate, right? The very meager increase in, the welfare, okay, immediate, right? What we're looking at, though, is they're looking to increase the total liability cap from $2 billion to $7.5 billion on the National Housing and Finance Investment Corporation. Well, what does that mean, right? Because that's a lot of words, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Basically, they're saying, hey, we're going to have more money to loan to new social and community housing projects so that we can see more social and community housing projects built, right? Now, they're expecting 7,000 more over the next 4 years, which sounds pretty good, right? But 7,000 is still actually relatively small in the grand scheme of things in terms of what we're looking at in terms of shortages. But again, I think the point here is that's not really an immediate term impact. It's going to take time for it to be built. And is that really going to immediately in the next couple of years probably have a big impact on both cost of living and distribution of income? Yeah,
and I was also going to add distribution of wealth as well. True. Yeah, because it's going to, as we know, the housing asset represents the largest proportion of households' wealth. So there is a bit of a double whammy, good coming from this. But as Ron was saying, it's probably going to take a fair bit of time. And if you're only going to support an additional 7,000 new dwellings, you have to wonder that's probably only 7,000 households in a very, very large, rapidly expanding population. So
that's right. Now, look, they've got some other things. They've got some expanded eligibility for the first home buyer guarantee to try to enable, more first home buyers to be able to get into the property market. They've got tax concessions to encourage...
which we talked about in the previous video.
That's right. Now, what's interesting, and it's something that we touched upon, a lot of these are yet to be passed because they do form part of a bill, right, that is in negotiation with the Greens to get it through. And so we've got some stuff here that is happening. We've got some stuff that may happen. We've got some stuff that may not happen. Again, there's really big question marks. And I think the broad criticism, really, some analysis is that housing's playing a huge role in driving cost of living. And it's really there's probably not enough being done.
Yeah, and I just want to talk about that long process. First of all, when you talk about the political process, that takes a long time, and so you mentioned that it might be passed, might not be passed, and it might look very different, and so they might make very different changes and concessions to appease the Greens at this point to basically get it through Parliament. And I think also the nature of these policies, if you want to go back to use the terminology of course, the implementation lag. right? So it's going to take a while to negotiate.
Great point.
And then it's also going to take time because this is going to have a very long impact lag because it's going to take a very long time to build. So you're actually getting very long lags in both the impact and the implementation. So it's going to be very difficult. Hope it goes through because I think we'd all agree that it's better that it goes through than it doesn't. Yeah. But to really see the benefits of it will take a fair bit of time.
And so I think the key is you can either look over the long term, but in the shorter to medium term, it's going to be challenging because of that. Yeah. So a couple of other things they're looking at trying to do here. They've got health policy. They're really trying to strengthen, and they're calling it the Strengthening Medicare Initiative. It's about $5.7 billion they're spending. Really, one of the big areas is to really provide an increase to GP bulk billing. And this is a bit of an interesting one because in part, right, it's there's a increased costs because GPs don't get a lot from Medicare for bulk billing. So it means that there's less people going into GPs as a profession in general practitioners for health, which creates shortages. On the flip side, though, you've got, as a result, a lot of GPs needing to charge fees, right, on top of what they get from the government to go and see a doctor. And again, that creates just impacts for really accessibility of services for low income, right? Because it's now going to cost you a lot more to just get health support. So what they're trying to do is basically trying to offer more, to hope in that the result is that more GPs continue therefore to offer bulk billing services because they're now getting more back from the government for those services. Again, remains to be seen, but the idea is that it's hopefully going to benefit people who can't afford necessarily health and reduce their cost of accessing health. So what they're saying is it basically triples the bulk billing incentive for GPs. And they're arguing, what their data says is that it's going to support 11.6 million Australians access a GP with no out-of-pocket costs. Now, what it doesn't say is how many are already impacting and accessing bulk billing services, right? So it's sometimes a little bit hard to really get a clear sense there. And they're spending more on the PBS, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, which is really where they basically subsidise the cost of a range of medications that you go to the pharmacy and buy, and you might not even be aware of it. You might just buy it, it's pretty cheap, great, and it turns out it was a lot more expensive before. Now, again, these really seem like a little bit of tinkering around the edges. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I felt that way. Yeah, because I almost feel like whenever I look at policies to improve distribution of income and wealth, when you start to get toward the part where you're talking about where they choose to spend in terms of services, I personally don't think that has a really direct impact. Like, because first of all, what you're assuming is that you're only going to be helping people who access this scheme. Now, don't get me wrong, many people do use the healthcare system. It's wonderful, but it's definitely going to it's almost like taking a degree of indirect impact, right? And so when we talk about the pensions and you talk about directly increasing the income, that I think that's usually a stronger point. But when you get to just improving access to services like Medicare and education and childcare, it definitely helps. But I would also argue that the impacts of that would be less direct.
And generally longer time lag as well, right? Or at least to see that impact. So a couple other quick things, important ones. There's an aged care wage increase. Now, I think that really came through, there was a lot of, during COVID, I think a lot of spotlight put on the aged care industry. So they added $11.3 billion to increase the award to aged care workers by 15%. And I think that is a pretty significant one, right? Like 15%, that's 250,000 workers. That's actually greater than inflation. So we've probably got one part of the economy that's maybe seeing an increase in real wages. Certainly not at 15, but we're seeing one part. So you can go, great, right? Big tick. There's an area there where you can see that, okay, the distribution of income and, for this, segment of the sort of, economy going in the right direction. Now, they've also got some Indigenous policies at play as well. What are those, Terry?
Yeah, so this is continuing a very, very common rhetoric that they have of closing the gap between the outcomes between First Nations Australians and non-First Nations Australians. So they've got $1.9 billion invested over 5 years to deliver improvements to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, I always find that for this, it's a decent amount of money, but they don't often specify a lot of detail around where the money's going and who like specifically which communities is it helping and in what sense. Now, we did have some stuff in the labour market video about the skills. Yeah. So there is going to be money put to training and giving vet options for First Nations people, which is great to see. to hopefully provide opportunities to increase the income that they earn. But other than that, I'm not seeing very much clarity, so to speak.
So let's dive in and do some analysis now. So, we've got some policies, we can see them. Great, right? Let's dive in and look at some of the analysis. Now, and you can go and read more. There's an Australian Council of Social Services, ACOS.
Love ACOS.
Yeah, they produce a lot of really great reports and insights that can really support you in your analysis when you're looking at distribution of income and wealth on the economy. And one of the things that they say is okay, great, they were big fans of the 15% pay rise for the aged care workers, the expansion of the parenting payment for single parents, right, that we talked about. Great, okay. Their really big concern with what we highlighted was that, job seeker, youth allowance, Oz study, ab study, special benefits going up by $40 a fortnight, right, really was well below. They were calling for $180 a week, right? So they got a $20 a week increase. Now, no, ACOS are going to go pretty hard on what they're recommending, okay? But I think their point really was that, as we highlighted, is that, is it really anywhere near enough, $3 a day, given the level of inflationary pressure that's been experienced?
And I hopefully that as students, you guys can also see that, whatever you've been spending at the canteen or in the grocery stores, you're definitely spending more than $3 a day more than you did before. So it's very clear. I think as Rowan says, ACOS does go hard, but I think they also are very grounded in what they're saying, in that it definitely is not enough. So you can definitely go with what they're saying here. They're not exaggerating. It is real. And
Mission Australia have an interesting sort of data point. And again, Mission Australia do some great reports that you can go and read, particularly around income inequality. And what they highlight is that, based on the government sort of welfare payments, you're on $52.85 a day, right? So, if you think about that, that's really for food, for electricity, for access to water, accommodation, whatever. It's really not a lot of money, right? And so their point is, it's really still nowhere near enough. And so we've got this challenge, right, where we really needed to see bigger support for income support and bigger cost of living pressure release, right, particularly around housing, to really see a better result. Now, they were a little more conservative. They were saying, look, we really feel like it needs to be at least $76 a day, right, as opposed to the $52. So they were saying $20 a day, which is about $140 a week, where ACOS was saying $180, right? So you're going to get some, different organisations having different numbers, but it still highlights that. Now, of course, the challenge in all of this, though, Terry, is conflict of objectives, right? So I think it's all well and good here to say, well, we're going to increase, welfare spending significantly, okay, more than the $3 a day, because we're seeing really this worsening income distribution occur. But then on the flip side, what we see is that pushes the budget from, mildly expansionary, potentially to
very expansionary.
Yes, exactly, which then creates more inflation, which then potentially leads to further erosion of living standards and worsening income distribution. So we've got this cycle. So in saying that, I think it's just a challenge that the government is trying to grapple with. Do you have anything you want to add on this, Terry?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, from my point of view, just add that essentially, you're right. You're dealing with a very big conflict, but I think also it's important to just link it back to what our viewers can basically talk about. If a government, we recognise that they have a very difficult balancing act to perform, but at the same time, like I've said, they know what to do, and they do a little bit of it, but they don't do enough. How do you accurately then just summarize that in almost like a thesis statement for an essay? What would you say? Like, I don't want to get too. I'll offer my personal opinion, but I want to hear from you first. How do you then, if we were just because this is our last video on the series, how do you then kind of just sum up? Has the government been effective with their achieving those objectives?
With this objective or more broadly?
Up to you.
Look, I feel like you've sort of got to zoom out and say, it feels like they've been broadly effective with many missed opportunities.
Right.
Because we're probably going to hit the economic growth. We're probably going to sit somewhere in that 1.5%.
But that's fairly conservative.
Yeah, and we need to probably be on the lower end to manage inflation, right? Okay. So we're probably going to hit that, right? Yeah. We're probably, if we think about the labour market, going to see a little bit of increase in unemployment, but that's largely driven by monetary, right?
And we do need that.
Yeah, and we're still going to be well below, like the Nauru, right? Or at least close to the Nauru, right? So it's like, okay, well, on the face of it, another tick, right? And then we get to in inflation. And it's like, look, again, a lot of the inflation is not caused by, issues the government can control. And they've got some things that they're doing that will support reducing inflation, right? Again, all of these, they could do more, but it's sort of like a tick, right? And then distribution of income is probably the one where I'd say at the moment, they're probably going to see it go backwards, right? Like, and it's the one where, we're not going to tick it, it's going to be like a cross. And again, that's in part because of just the bigger picture context they're trying to grapple with. And so my take is like, well, we've sort of seen 3 out of 4 ticks, but in all of that, there's a real sense of like underwhelm, like I felt like, maybe that there could have been a little more, ambitious, a little more creative, made some cuts in other places. And I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm pretty similar with you. I think you're right in recognizing that they have been successful in some areas. If you've been a trooper and you've watched all 4 videos with us, thank you very much, first of all. But secondly, I think you notice that we've leveled a fair amount of, raised a few questions, leveled some criticisms, and justifiably so. I think we recognize that it's flawed in many ways, but it also does do many things that it needs to do at the moment. So I'm with you. I feel like I want to use, just because we're filming this during the time of the Women's World Cup, I want to use the soccer analogy. It's definitely a game where you win 1-0, right? Or maybe in this case 3-0, if you want to use the 3 ticks.
Or maybe it's a penalty shootout.
Okay.
Win, right? Let's go there.
Okay,
right?
Yeah. So we've had a 0-0 draw. We've had a penalty shootout where we've won, let's say 3-2 on penalties. And so you're happy to go through, but you don't feel that you've really done a good job. You don't pat yourself on the back at the end of the day, because I think you're right. There's just so many missed chances. Like, in a soccer match, you miss open goal misses. And so I just think that there was opportunities to do a lot more. And I also want to just talk about the fact that you said there was a cross with income distribution, and I'm going to be a bit critical here and say, well, I'm going to be a bit cynical here. They've been strategic in choosing which box to not tick. Right? Because as you said, that's the one where you're going to see the repercussions of that furthest down the track. And so if you are interested in getting a second term, as we know about those political factors at play, if you have to sack one.
And I think for Labor as well, I think you're right on the money. Like, for Labor, there's been, I think, an association for so many years, right? And again, the Liberals have done a lot to sort of cultivate this sort of association for Labor, that, you put Labor in and they spend big on welfare. Right, I think that's one of the big things, and it was fascinating because during COVID, like, Labor actually were advocating pretty hard for much larger increases with the Libs for welfare, right? And so it's quite fascinating that you see them now and actually their income distribution policy feels a lot more like a Liberal Party, right? Like, in terms of what we might have expected, right? Like, keep it lean, some increases but not big, play around the edges. Certainly remains to be seen what they do with housing policy, right? Like, I think that may be the area that they, go above and beyond what you would have seen with a Liberal government. But I think you're right. I think they've been quite strategic. And look, I think this goes to, at the end though, that there is a conflict in objectives. Like, it is, like a falsity to assume that any government can achieve all of them simultaneously, right? And so there does need to be a choice. And clearly, at the end of the day, inflation has been the dominant choice of issue, right? And they've had to make it that. I think if they didn't, they would have been in a lot more of challenge. Now, no, I will just say one thing, and then I'm going to throw over to you, Terry. Yeah. One of the big things they did come, and this goes to this criticism as well, they came to the election on, we are going to help manage cost of living, right? Knowing that some of it was out of their control, right? And I think that cost of living also then goes to this question of income distribution, right? And I think that's where it's interesting that they, if we really look at it, their big policies, or at least their statements when they came to be elected was, cost of living, we're going to help you solve it. We're going to, certainly try to work better on distribution of income, which is connected to that, and environment, right? We're going to make...
That's the first time in like almost an hour of a video that we've actually mentioned the word. We've mentioned it.
And so I think it's interesting that when you look at that and then you look at what they're focused on in the budget, very different.
Yeah. So I actually just wanted to kind of tag along with what you were saying. So I want to, again, use a bit of a Gen Z term. I hope. Let me know if it's cringe, but it almost feels like the Liberals have just gaslit Labor into basically making a budget that's so far away from what their identity has been in the past and also in recent years. So I would almost say that congratulations, Liberal, you have girl bossed, gaslit and gate kept Labor into a budget which I guess, I think if I was to sum it up in one word, it's just unimpressive.
So there you have it, guys. That is our end of our 4-part series on how the budget really is going to impact the economy and some analysis. If you have any questions, particularly in this case around income distribution or living standards, leave a comment below. Otherwise, if you haven't, hit subscribe because we'll have more videos as the year unfolds, both on HSC Economics and navigating 11 and 12 more broadly. So we will see you in a future video.